Okay, I can see we hit 1 minute after the hour. Um, my name is Matt Thomas, and thank you for tuning in to the USGS Landslide Hazards Seminar. This meeting is hosted by the Landslide Hazards Program and co-organized with contributions from Stephen Slaughter and Jamie Kostelnik. And for those of you that are new to this meeting, you have the ability to submit questions via the chat window or to use the raise your hand feature in combination with your microphone and video camera. We're going to wait until the end of today's presentation to take questions and facilitate discussions. So please, just in the meantime, make sure your video camera is off and your microphone is muted when you're not intending to speak. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Paula Burgi. She did her undergraduate work at Smith College studying geoscience and astronomy, and then subsequently spent 2 years working at the Earth Observatory of Singapore as a research assistant, and then which led her to doing her PhD at Cornell, which focused on remote sensing observations of ground deformation and surface change with a focus on InSAR data. She's now at the USGS as a Mendenhall Fellow and working on projects that aim to improve USGS earthquake-triggered ground failure, landslide, and liquefaction type products, mainly using remote sensing data. So Paula, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and let you take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about this weird observation that we saw with remote sensing data after the 2019 Ridgecrest earthquake. It essentially was kind of a wild goose chase of a project, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later on. I also just want to quickly say that I intended for this presentation to be a little more polished than it is, because I've spent the last week basically 100% of my time working on ground failure response to the earthquake in Turkey. So depending on how much time there is left, if anyone is interested in seeing some of those observations, mostly landslides from that event that we've been seeing, I feel free to stay on at the end, but I am also not quite sure how long I'll take, so we'll see. All right, so this presentation focuses mostly on liquefaction, which I am aware this is the landslide seminar, and I am not talking about landslides necessarily, but they do tie together in some interesting ways, I think. And hopefully kind of the lessons learned from this project could apply to landslide problems as well. So before I kind of dive into the project itself, I want to take a bit of a step back and just talk about earthquake-triggered ground failure in general. So the way that earthquake-triggered ground failure is typically thought of is kind of this split between earthquake-triggered landslides and earthquake-triggered liquefaction. So as so everyone kind of knows what landslides are here, hopefully. I'm not going to try to explain it, but liquefaction you might be a little bit or not as familiar with. So the idea of liquefaction is essentially in waterlogged, kind of loosely compacted sediments. When an earthquake shakes those sediments, the particles in that material can kind of reconfigure into a denser configuration, and that causes the bearing load to be the load to be bared by the liquid, the water in between the particles, rather than the particles itself. And what that actually means is that the ground turns from a solid to a liquid. That can express at the surface as things as either water or sand. Often you see it as sand boils, and they look kind of like little volcanoes made out of sand. So that's kind of a quick liquefaction background. I just want to say, and this is important, this is me getting on my soapbox, but also important for the presentation, that this kind of landslide liquefaction binary is not necessarily the best way to think about earthquake-triggered ground failure. It makes complete sense in terms of the USGS model, which I'll describe in a second, but there's definitely, if not a spectrum, just kind of a whole, I don't know, sphere of connected mechanisms or expressions that of ground failure that's caused by earthquakes. So landslides, liquefaction, but also lateral spread, you know, where exactly do those fall on this? Sinkholes, this thing called cyclic clay softening, which don't ask me about it because I just mostly know the word and that it exists. And then a bunch of other things that that have been observed, have not been observed, etc. So basically, there's more to earthquake triggered ground failure than just the liquefaction landslide binary. More on this later. But in terms of kind of the most simple definition, we'll go back to this kind of landslides and liquefaction being the two earthquake triggered ground failure processes. I again will just focus mainly on liquefaction, but the USGS earthquake hazards program actually produces a ground failure product that is published alongside other important information when a large enough earthquake occurs. So when an earthquake of a sufficient magnitude happens, this ground failure product is triggered. And first I'll show you what it looks like, then I'll talk a little bit about how it's generated. So for this particular earthquake, this example, which is the 2021 Haiti earthquake, very devastating earthquake. Here is just kind of a zoom in on where the earthquake happens. These contours are just showing the intensity of shaking. If we overlay on that the different ground failure products, this is the landslide probability estimate. So this is the USGS product that predicts where landslides are most likely to happen due to this particular earthquake. And then this is the liquefaction probability estimate. So where the algorithm thinks that liquefaction is most likely. And the dark purple is high and the lighter colors are low. So you can kind of see they're inverted from each other. Landslides typically happen in like areas with more topography. Liquefaction happens in flatter areas that tend to be saturated with water, or that are saturated with water. So now that you kind of have like seen the product itself, I'll talk a little bit about how it's made without any equations, just like visually. So the liquefaction, and again, we're just going to talk about the liquefaction one. We've seen the landslide one; it's cool. I'm sure I'll work on it eventually, but we're just again focusing on liquefaction. So the liquefaction ground failure product, there's a few different inputs. So the first one is the predictive variables. So those are kind of listed on the side there. These are kind of global-ish raster variables. This is VS30. There's a mean annual precipitation layer, distance from a coastline, distance from rivers, and a water table depth layer. And then finally, the peak ground velocity from the actual shaking from an earthquake. And all of these layers are put into a logistic regression model alongside the second important factor in the model, which is ground failure inventories. So these are all points where after an earthquake, that specific point on the surface was identified to either have liquefaction or no liquefaction. So at each one of these points, a raster value is extracted, and then together those are modeled to kind of interpolate anywhere else on over kind of anywhere where there is an earthquake, whether or not that specific point or pixel within a map would experience liquefaction. So here's just a quick example of the liquefaction inventory. The blue points are points that experienced liquefaction from an earthquake that I should remember the name of, but now I'm completely blanking on. And the red points are points that did not experience liquefaction. And as you can see, most of these points, they were not actually measured points. It was just kind of a sampling of points that where there was not actively an observation of liquefaction. So those are the two things that go into the model. Obviously, no model is perfect. The liquefaction ground failure model could definitely be improved. And I just sort of gave a basic breakdown of some of the ways in which some of the issues with the ground failure model. So in terms of the predictive variables, like that VS30, distance from coast, distance from rivers, all of these variables have to be global, and therefore they can lack accuracy or resolution. And there are other very likely helpful or useful predictor variables that are not incorporated in the ground failure model and the liquefaction model, for example, soil moisture. And then in terms of the inventory, as you kind of saw with this distribution of points, it's actually very hard to get a complete inventory of ground failure, particularly points with no liquefaction. People who are in the field and kind of creating these inventories aren't marking every single place where they don't see liquefaction. They're mostly just marking where they do see liquefaction. And even for the points that are liquefaction, it is still very difficult to find every single instance of liquefaction after an earthquake event. So that's just kind of a broad overview of the model and the issues with it. In terms of the liquefaction model itself, what these issues have kind of presented as is that often or sometimes the liquefaction model actually overpredicts where liquefaction is. So it thinks that there is much more widespread liquefaction than there actually was, or it predicts more liquefaction, a higher probability of liquefaction. Okay, so the next question is, how can we improve our model? In terms of predictive variables, obviously we can test out new predictive variables to see if there's any other variables that fit better with the inventory of points. And in terms of the inventory, we can add to the inventory. So we can make existing inventories more complete, potentially through remote sensing data, or add new earthquake inventory points. So this is how I ended up studying or looking at the Ridgecrest earthquake. I will describe in a moment and show you exactly where the Ridgecrest earthquake was if you're not familiar with it. But just know that it was a relatively large earthquake in Southern California, or I guess southeastern California. And it is a great candidate to both test out new variables because of all the data that's been collected there, and also potentially add it to the liquefaction inventory. So that was sort of the aim when I started this project, and sort of kind of what I was hired initially to do. I did not do either of these things, and what happened was like completely off the rails and went in a different direction. But in the end, it does actually tie back to some of these questions of how we can improve our model. So just bear with me for a while while I bring you on this sort of wild goose chase of a project. Okay. So the Ridgecrest earthquake, it was a magnitude 7.1 earthquake located kind of down here in southeastern California. The surface rupture is shown in red. Again, the kind of shake map is shown in these orange to green contours, orange being a greater degree of shaking. And this is the liquefaction, the predicted probability of liquefaction using the USGS's current real-time model. So a lot of liquefaction was, or there was a high probability of liquefaction in the area around China Lake and kind of right along the rupture, but also in this other lake bed here called Searles Lake. Just from ground observations in the field, there was actually not like an enormous, there was certainly some, but not an enormous amount of liquefaction, especially kind of out here in this area. Most of it was very concentrated along the fault. But in Searles Lake, it was reported that there was a ton of liquefaction. So we were kind of curious, well, to improve our model, we should understand why we saw a lot of liquefaction in Searles Lake and not China Lake. Oh, I don't know why this is so blurry. Sorry about that. Well, hopefully you can, basically this is just showing the elevation, the topography. It's the goal of this is just to show you that this is a basin. There's kind of some local depressions as well, but for the most part, it's like a very flat, dry lake bed. And I should mention, China Lake and Searles Lake, they say lake, but really they're like sometimes a little wet, but mostly like dry lake beds, like playas. So again, I don't know why this is blurry, I apologize, but if I kind of just overlay onto that, this is the using remote sensing, optical remote sensing data. This is where we believe there was allegedly liquefaction. Or I'm going to just kind of moving forward use the general term surface ejecta because that doesn't imply a mechanism. So this is where material from the subsurface was ejected onto the surface and triggered by the Ridgecrest earthquake. So just to kind of give you an idea of how we created this data set, I'm going to show you some remote sensing, just some optical remote sensing images of this lake bed. So this is Searles Lake in optical imagery. As you can see, people have messed with it a lot. Turns out this is actively mined and has been for a long time. And it's mined for evaporite minerals. This image was taken about a month before the Ridgecrest earthquake. So the dates are up here. This is June 6th. I put the date of the earthquake down here for reference. So we're just going to kind of go forward in time. Just note that there's kind of a lot of white stuff in general. That's kind of the precipitated halite, the evaporite minerals on the surface. So as we move forward in time, this is about a month before, this is a few weeks before the earthquake, 2-ish weeks, week and a half before. This is right before the earthquake. And that is when the earthquake happened. So I'm just going to flip back and forth between the two. So you can see it goes from a lot of those areas that are kind of bright white, kind of turn either black or kind of a dark copper color. And so when I show you this, which is just our very simple method of detecting where surface ejecta occurred, it is literally just taking this, subtracting it from this image, and then finding areas that got darker. We just kind of set a threshold. So this is by far the easiest identification of surface change I have ever done. It's just a simple subtraction. But again, as you can see, kind of leading up to the earthquake, most of those, the areas kind of a light white color. And then when the earthquake occurs, all of this material is ejected onto the surface. Okay, so that's where that came from. So let's just talk, oh my gosh, it's so blurry. I really apologize. I don't know why it's doing that. So let's just talk quickly about the actual observations of ground failure in Searles Lake. There was one group that actually got access to the lake bed. It's very difficult to get access to the lake bed because the whole lake bed is essentially owned by this mine, and the mine does not they don't want people kind of coming into their property. But luckily, Zimmer et al., their team were able to get there. They kind of found a lot of this surface ejecta, and as they classified it as liquefaction ejecta, down here in the kind of southern part of the lake bed. The red dots are just showing where they took photos. It was sort of kind of along an ephemeral fluvial network. And again, just as a reminder, liquefaction occurs in these kind of loosely packed sediments, often sands. So that is kind of what they were assuming existed in this part of the lake bed. So we have like kind of confirmed liquefaction over here. This is pre-event, this is post-event. Pre-event, you don't really see a lot of dark stuff. Post-event, all of a sudden, there's like all of this dark material that's kind of ejected onto the surface. So if we take this kind of not dark stuff and dark stuff approach to what we can call liquefaction, reasonably call liquefaction, and just apply it to another part of the lake bed, we can look over here. So this is kind of in the north central part of the lake bed. Here is not dark stuff, here is dark stuff that is ejected. So I think most people would reasonably assume that this is also liquefaction. It looks really similar to this area in terms of surface reflectance and pre-event kind of behavior. But this ground failure, the surface ejecta, is in this weird hexagonal pattern. So I just kind of blew up this image so you can see it a little better. And I asked the question, what the hexagon is happening here? Sorry for the pun. So initially, I thought these were giant mud cracks. They are not. Turns out this is very much a pre-existing pattern, and it is directly related to the mining that is done in this lake bed. So the mining here in this particular portion is called solution mining, and this is a kind of summary figure showing what solution mining is. So what they do is in solution mining is you inject fluid into the subsurface, and you inject it along the edges of each kind of hexagonal node. And then at the center of each hexagon, fluid is extracted from the subsurface. And the idea is that if you are dealing with evaporite minerals, those minerals are water soluble. So as you inject water into the subsurface, it will dissolve those evaporite minerals. And then that saturated brine is pumped back up and you can extract whatever mineral of interest. Here in particular, they are interested in borax. So that's what's going on here. We have kind of this pre-existing hexagonal pattern. The edges are where they are extracting, the edges of each hexagon are where they're injecting fluid. The center of each hexagon is where they're extracting. We only see really evidence for surface expression of surface ejecta at the sites where they are injecting fluid, which I'll get back to later. I also just want to take a step back here and say that this is actually a very cool and maybe not, but it's a very unique observation and a really interesting example of how people can actually regulate ground failure from earthquakes. And I also think it's very interesting that we see it very clearly kind of in the whole area where they are where they're mining, but we basically see nothing over to the east where they have not mined yet. So that is kind of connected in with the whole story, but I want to make sure I point those things out first. Okay, so we sort of wanted to understand how and why and you know, if it's even possible for humans to kind of regulate where like surface ejecta manifests in the first place. It could be kind of an interesting tool to use in other environments, perhaps around buildings or infrastructure. So we kind of dug into this this area to try to really understand what's going on in the subsurface. And we did that by using 3 different tools. The first is geologic cores. So that sort of gives us an idea of what the subsurface is composed of. The second is trying to understand how the subsurface behaves. So like, is it likely to experience liquefaction? Is it not? And the third is using InSAR surface displacement. So if you don't know anything about InSAR, I'll do just the briefest of introductions later, but just know that it's a way to measure the surface displacement through time. So we're going to start to try to answer our question of what the hexagon is happening here. First, by looking at the geologic core. So what is the subsurface actually composed of? So to kind of go into that, it's important to note that Searles Lake has been actively mined for over 140 years. This is actually like a very historically significant area. And also because of that, there are a lot of published USGS cores throughout the lake bed. It looks like my little legend didn't show up here, but essentially all the black dots and also this big white dot, these are all core logs of the lake bed. And this is just a picture from one of the, those like sepia toned books about things. It's from one of those. And this is, I believe it's from 1917, and it's showing these kind of horse-drawn carriages taking away stuff. I think they're actually removing kind of the units that are of no interest to like the kind of mud units. So anyways, okay, so here is a kind of interpretive cross section. I forgot to put the reference here. Sorry about that, but it's from, I believe it's from Smith et al. 1990 or 1957, and they use a lot of these cores just to kind of create or to kind of illustrate that a lot of or most of the salt, the evaporite minerals that were deposited in this basin are kind of in the central portion of the basin. That's what these kind of lighter units are. And they kind of pinch out at the edges. So there's a lot less salt at the periphery of the lake compared to the center of the lake. And also, this is not kind of shown in here, but it's kind of said again and again through these USGS publications that in between the salt units, they generally just call those units mud, and what those units are composed of are almost entirely of clays near the center of the lake bed. But as you grade towards the edges, or as you go towards the edges of the lake bed, it grades into coarser material. So it goes from clay to silt to sandier material towards the edges. Also, if you can see this dashed line here around the edges, this was defined as the area that has the thickest salt units and the finest clays. And our hexagons, the hexagons I was showing you, are up here. So they fall within that area of thick clays, very fine grained material. And to really hammer home this point, this is just from a publication that compared China Lake, a core taken from China Lake and a core taken from Searles Lake. And the material in pink are evaporite minerals. And you can see that the Searles Lake core, this was taken just south of the hexagons, is almost entirely evaporite minerals. And very notably contains no sand in this site, this core site. There is no sand. And just recall that sand-sized particles are the thing that liquefaction is really kind of best known to occur and rarely does not occur in anything besides sandy material. So the fact that there's no sand in this area was very surprising. Okay, so that was geologic cores. Let's talk quickly about the geotechnical CPT data. And I'll define CPT in a second, but the idea of using this data is to kind of first understand how the subsurface behaves, and using that to kind of think about if we would expect liquefaction or not in the basin. So again, here is Searles Lake. Our hexagons are over here. The data, CPT data, which stands for cone penetration test data, it was actually taken on the periphery of the lake bed over here. So if we again kind of look at this cross section A to A prime, it's taken kind of in an area where there's probably coarser material and less salt, so it doesn't exactly reflect the geologic setting at the center of the lake bed, but it's all we got, so that's why we're using it. So this is just again for reference. Here is the USGS CPT truck that is used to collect CPT data, and this is just kind of a basic figure showing what it is. So you take a rod that has a tip, a cone-shaped tip, you shove it into the ground, and you measure the resistance to being shoved in the ground on the cone and the friction of material against the sleeve. And that's measured very precisely at different depth intervals. So here's an example of one of those records, a CPT record. So we have our cone resistance, so the resistance of the cone being put in the ground, and our normalized friction ratio, which is related again to this, the friction of as material passes next to the sleeve of the cone. I don't expect you to understand what this is saying at all. But to kind of break it down in a more understandable sense, this data has long been used and through many data points been kind of broken up into different behavior types. And the behavior types are listed here. The behavior type that is associated with liquefaction is SC, which is right here. It's the contractive spans. I have plotted in all the points here are all the data that was acquired from Trona, from our CPT location. And then I've shown in green the points that fall within the kind of liquefiable zone where we would expect to see liquefaction. And then I kind of took all the points from each of these areas and made a bar chart. So it turns out that the material that you would expect to be liquefiable, so traditionally liquefiable material, there's a very small percentage. It's not kind of all within one unit either. It's kind of distributed throughout, and it certainly could not account for the amount of surface ejecta that we see. And this, again, to say this is on the periphery of the lake bed where you expect more sand. Clay-like materials are absolutely not expected to experience liquefaction. Okay, so let's go to our InSAR displacements. So if you don't know anything about InSAR, just know that it is a satellite, usually a satellite measurement technique. And it is actually a very cool and amazing, it blows my mind every time I think about it, way to measure very small displacements on the ground from satellite data. So here, I'm again zooming in on our area with the hexagons. Here I'm showing the subsidence rate with InSAR. So this is the rate at which the ground is going down, and this is only pre-event, so this is only for data before the earthquake occurred. And as you can see, along the edges of the hexagons, our hexagonal pattern, we're seeing more subsidence, or a faster rate of subsidence than at the center of the hexagons. And in general, when you see ground subsidence, it implies some sort of volume reduction in the subsurface. So that could be sediment compaction, it could be removal of material, it could be void space opening and kind of collapse. So the observation just, it implies a volume reduction, but we don't necessarily know the cause. I also just want to remind everyone that the edges of the hexagon, again, where we're seeing this higher rate of subsidence, is where fluid is being injected into the subsurface, not extracted, but like injected. That is very counterintuitive. Normally, when you think of, fluid extraction, like, taking water out of aquifers in the subsurface, you would think that those areas would be subsiding, but no, it's actually the areas that are experiencing fluid injection. I think I'm going to skip this slide because I think it's interesting, but not necessary for the story. So, okay, we're gonna put everything together that we've learned so far from our different techniques. So from the geologic cores, we have learned that the central portion of Searles Lake, where the hexagons are located, it's mainly composed of evaporite minerals with some mostly clay, maybe a little bit of silt. From the geotechnical data, even on the periphery of the lake bed, there's actually very little traditionally liquefiable material. And so if we put these two things together, there's no material you would expect to liquefy, and the behavior does not indicate liquefaction, that it is likely that liquefaction was not actually responsible for all of this surface ejecta like previously thought. The InSAR data tells us that we're seeing a faster rate of subsidence at the fluid injection sites, which again applies a greater degree of volume reduction. And this data is actually going to help us answer the question, what if not liquefaction, like what's going on? How can you get like what looks exactly like liquefaction on the surface and it not be liquefaction? So to answer that question, we kind of came up with this alternate model that I've been calling liquefiction, because it looks a lot like liquefaction. It like, what is it, like walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, but it's not a duck. So we came up with this kind of alternate mechanism that kind of relies on all of this data together. So here is our liquefiction model. And I'll show you kind of in parts. So the first step is here we have a kind of cross section of the subsurface. It is a brine saturated area. We know that the water table is very shallow in Searles Lake, so this is all saturated. As fluid is being pumped down into the subsurface and subsequently extracted out of the subsurface, it dissolves the soluble minerals, right? So you're going to actually create a fluid-filled cavity in the subsurface. Any insoluble sediments will kind of settle in that area, but because you are creating a literal hole in the ground, a void space, that's going to cause the surface to subside. And that's why we're seeing subsidence at the fluid injection sites. When an earthquake occurs, those cavities collapse, and the fluid that was kind of filling that cavity is being pushed out through the path of least resistance, which happens to be kind of the area where they are like the what do you call it? Like the hole, the bore hole where they drilled the injection well. And then we see what again looks a lot like liquefaction, but is actually not the process of liquefaction at the surface. I'm kind of ignoring these three. I'm happy to talk about them later. I'm kind of focusing on just the mining areas, but that's sort of our running theory. So I'm going to just quickly go over the implications of this, because this is kind of like, oh, weird, cool, you figured out one weird observation maybe. But it turns out there might be actually more implications than initially we initially thought when I started looking into this more. So the first observation to make is that, again, if we go back to the Ridgecrest earthquake, we have Searles Lake here, we have China Lake here. You would expect to see a lot of liquefaction, especially since China Lake kind of falls right on the rupture zone of the Ridgecrest earthquake. But if we take that same technique of optical change detection and apply it over here, we see that there is a much kind of lower concentration of surface ejecta in China Lake than in Searles Lake. And even though China Lake has a lot of sand, as we saw in that core, there's a lot of potentially liquefiable material in the subsurface, but we really don't see nearly as much surface ejecta as we do in Searles Lake. The second observation is looking at the implication, I'm sorry, is looking at the Ridgecrest earthquake versus the Gujarat earthquake. So if you're not familiar, I'll talk in a second about the Gujarat earthquake. It was in India in 2001. But if we kind of just take two pre-event images, the top one is from the Ridgecrest earthquake, the bottom one is from the Gujarat earthquake. Turns out this part of the or this area is also an evaporite rich semi-dry lake bed, a very similar depositional environment and similar geologic units in the subsurface here in Gujarat and Ridgecrest. If we look at our observations immediately after the earthquake, similar to the Ridgecrest earthquake, where there's very, very dark material is being ejected onto the surface, we see something very similar in the Gujarat earthquake. In the case of the Gujarat earthquake, this area is not being actively mined. A lot of this is just from kind of following local depressions or river channels. But again, we see kind of light colored stuff, dark colored stuff being ejected onto the surface. And the final observation is that that I haven't kind of presented yet is in the Ridgecrest earthquake, immediately following the earthquake, the material was very dark in color. But as time went on, that material went from like black to white. And that's because the fluid that was ejected alongside the actual sediment is saturated with evaporite minerals. So as it dries out, those evaporite minerals precipitate out of solution and are depositive and reflect, are highly reflective. So we see that in the Ridgecrest earthquake, and we also see that in the Gujarat earthquake down here. That a lot of the kind of darker material is kind of turning this lighter hue. So the fact that they're very similar environments, and we see very similar surface reflectance behavior, to me implies that we're seeing potentially the same mechanism of surface ejecta. Now is a good time to point out that this earthquake is actually a very well-known event as a liquefaction triggering earthquake. It caused a lot of damage, widespread damage and fatalities. And the points that in the liquefaction inventory from the Gujarat earthquake actually make up the greatest number of points in the liquefaction inventory. So if our inventory is like a large percentage of the Gujarat earthquake, and what we're seeing isn't liquefaction, that could be a problem, right? So to kind of put everything together, bring it all home. The key point here is like, be careful of liquefaction. Don't mistake one for the other. So surface ejecta from both the Ridgecrest and Gujarat earthquake previously have been assumed to be liquefaction. For both earthquake, there was an abnormally large amount of surface ejecta observed. So the idea is that maybe this other process that isn't liquefaction, this kind of liquefiction process, could be triggered at actually a lower shaking threshold than traditional liquefaction. So if that's true, it's important to differentiate between the two and not include liquefiction ejecta and liquefaction ejecta in the same model, in the USGS ground failure model. And also to kind of bring it back to the USGS model, because liquefaction points are included in the liquefaction inventory, that could be a reason why the liquefaction model can overpredict the amount of liquefaction. Because if you include data that is triggered at a lower threshold, then your model will also have a lower threshold for predicting liquefaction. So I hope I'm not being too confusing with my liquefaction terminology, but yeah, happy to answer any questions about that. Okay. Oh, I'm like took up more time than I thought I would. So the other thing, and this is kind of a little more philosophical or maybe or something, but both the Ridgecrest and Gujarat earthquakes are, to my knowledge, please correct me if you know of any other events, but to my knowledge are really the only events for which kind of freely available quote unquote coarse 10-meter optical remote sensing observations have successfully identified ground failure. So they both have been kind of held up as these examples of, you know, wow, look what we can do with optical remote sensing. We detected all of this liquefaction. But if for both of these earthquakes we're not seeing liquefaction, I think we should just kind of reflect a little bit about what techniques should be used where. And, you know, if you don't see something with one observation, it doesn't mean it's not there. If you do see something, it could not be the thing you think it is. Basically, the idea is that like ground observations are really important. And kind of, and I think it can be really easy to just take any sort of remote sensing data and be like, hey, look what I found, this thing. And this is a cautionary tale to kind of say, hey, maybe it's not the thing that you thought it was. And just kind of, yeah, be a little cautious when using these techniques. Okay, so my last closing remark is just like, if nothing else, this pattern, this kind of ejecta pattern is really a remarkable example of how humans can either exacerbate or regulate earthquake-triggered ground failure. We also saw it in the Palu earthquake, where there were these large kind of lateral spreads that were caused by artificially elevated water table. We see it in artificial fill, which is, you know, maybe the most susceptible material, which is created by humans. And this is just another example of how we have a tendency to create optimal environments for ground failure, I guess. So yeah, that's all I have on this. I'm happy to take any questions.